Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mars Narani, and I'm the Digital Communications Specialist with the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. Welcome to our first speaking session for Asian Heritage Month. We are so excited to welcome Samya Hasan to Western. Before we begin with her introduction, I would like to make you aware of some resources available to attendees. The closed captions have been enabled. You can access the captions by hitting the CC button in your control bar. The chat function has been disabled for this event. If you have a question, please submit it in the Q&A tab on your control options, and we will review them at the end. Lastly, we would like to remind students, staff, and faculty members at Western to complete the Western Equity Census. Beginning in October 2021, the Western Equity Census is the first comprehensive demographic survey for all staff, students, and faculty, which will help us to understand the demographics of university and enhance support of diversity and equity of our community. The census, which is voluntary and confidential, takes less than 5 minutes to complete. It is available online through My Human Resources for employees and Student Center for students. To learn more, visit the links provided in the chat or www.president.uwo.ca/equity-census. We will begin with a land acknowledgement offered by Arti Vyas, project coordinator for the Equity Census.
Thank you so much, Mars. So we acknowledge that Western University is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, Lenapehoik, and Attawandaron peoples, on lands connected with the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. With this, we respect the long-standing relationships that Indigenous nations have to this land, as they are the original caretakers. We acknowledge historical and ongoing injustices that Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit endure in Canada, and we accept responsibility as a public institution to contribute toward revealing and correcting miseducation, as well as renewing respectful relationships with Indigenous communities through our teaching, research, and community service.
Thank you, Arti. Now we welcome Andreen Jackson-Ellis, Administrative Coordinator at the Office of EDI, to introduce our special guest speaker.
Thank you, Mars. Samya Hasan is the Executive Director of the Council of Agencies Servicing South Asians Social Justice, CASSA. It's a social justice umbrella organization that advocates on behalf of individuals, groups, and organizations to meet the needs of South Asian communities and is committed to the elimination of all forms of discrimination from Canadian society. Samya leads various projects and advocacy groups, such as the Anti-Hate Community Leaders Group to combat online hate and hate crimes in Canada, national research on gender-based violence, civic engagement campaigns, legal aid education for immigrants and refugees, health equity advocacy for racialized communities, and COVID-19 relief and vaccine engagement projects. Samya holds a Master's of Public Policy degree from the University of Toronto. On behalf of Western University and the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, we welcome you, Samya.
Awesome, great. Thank you so much, Andreen, Arti, and Mars for that introduction and for inviting me to speak today. And also a shout out to Leslie for finding me and for giving me this space to speak about our organization and also some of the things that we're doing in collaboration, not with South Asian, just with South Asian communities, but other racialized communities. So I'm just going to share my screen very quickly, and we'll go from there. So hopefully everybody can see that. So as it was mentioned, my name is Samya Hasan. I'm the executive director for an organization called the Council of Agencies Serving South Asians. If you haven't heard of the organization, that's okay. We actually serve organizations that serve South Asian communities. So it's an umbrella role that we have. We do a lot of capacity building work with our members. We do a lot of advocacy work. We do a lot of policy and training work. So before I get started in the presentation on South Asian Heritage Month, which is, the month of May, I'd like to, I know there was a land acknowledgement, but as somebody that is a settler on this land, I'd like to do a territory acknowledgement myself. So the work of CASSA takes place on traditional Indigenous territories of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and most recently the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. So we're located in C-Takaronto, also known as Toronto. It is the traditional Mohawk name of this area, and it means trees in the water. And the areas around Toronto, around the greater Toronto area, are still home to Indigenous people. And as an organization and as an individual, I'm grateful, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to meet, work, and play on this territory as settlers. And personally, as an immigrant from South Asia, the territory acknowledgement has its own unique meaning to me. And you can see this picture of myself. This is actually from a couple of days ago. I traveled to British Columbia to speak at another conference there, and just taking in a lot of the nature and the beauty of that land really made me think about what territory acknowledgement means to me. And being mindful of my impact, and not just impact on social interaction in the organization that I work for, but my environmental impact and how I live my life here in Canada. It also makes me think about using my power and my privilege to share the space that I have, that I may be given, and to work in solidarity and be in a relational allyship with Indigenous communities. And I'll talk a little bit about that throughout my presentation, but just one example of that is being a person of South Asian descent and being in a leadership position. I'm sometimes given the privilege to speak and to represent our communities at tables that are decision-making tables, and tables with powerful folks that can impact change. And so really using that role to display that allyship and to display that solidarity. So a couple of things that I wanted to also just touch on before I get into the nitty-gritty of the presentation, and that just helps people understand some of the things that I'm going to say today. I think everything has background and has context. So I think this is just kind of laying the context and the foundation of where I'm coming from, what our organization is doing, just to give people some background in terms of what we're going to discuss for the remainder of the presentation. So in terms of the social location, so I'm, as mentioned, I'm the executive director of CASSA. I'm also a Muslim identifying woman. I'm a South Asian. I'm an immigrant. My parents came to Canada when I was very young, when I was 8 years old, from a South Asian country called Pakistan. I'm a mother of 2 children. And so all of these things I intentionally say out loud, and it's because I want to be aware, again, of where my privilege is, and I want to be aware of my identity, and I want to be aware of the intersections of my identity, and I do have privilege, but then I also understand that there are certain spaces where I may be marginalized because of some of the identities that I carry. And just a bit about my journey. to being here today. So everybody has different journeys that they take, which get them to where they are at the present time. So as I mentioned, I'm a daughter of immigrant parents from Pakistan. Before I came to CASSA, I worked as a bureaucrat for the city of Toronto. And I say the word bureaucrat in the nicest possible way. I was I worked at the Affordable Housing Office there. I also worked at the Municipal Licensing and Standards Office. And before that, I had undergone my education at the University of Toronto. So both my undergrad and my master's degrees are from the University of Toronto. And again, I say all of this because the trajectory of my experience and my journey and where I was educated and where I came from has a lot to do with my perspectives today. So it's important for us to intentionally acknowledge all of this. Some of the values that I hold, and this is the reason why, I am the work at CASSA is so close to me, and I've been doing it for a very long time. In my career trajectory, which has not been very long, but most of my career trajectory has been here with CASSA. And some of those values include values of social justice, social well-being, racial justice. I am a huge believer in community-informed work. So anything that is created for the community should be informed by the community. And that is one of the central values that we bring into our work at CASSA. And finally, something that's very much related to the allyship work that we're doing is collaboration. That value of collaboration is key to our work. Over the last, I would say 5 to 7 years, we've really been pushing our organization to do a lot of the work that we do in solidarity and in collaboration with, again, not just South Asian serving organizations, but other racialized communities as well, and building that culture of sharing resources. And again, I'll go into a bit of that in my presentation as well, and what that means and how we're able to do that. And just a couple of things about my struggles. I think anybody from racialized communities or Indigenous communities will have their own unique struggles on this land. But as a female leader who is visibly Muslim, I've had my own share of heavy burden of stereotypes that I had to, that I still face, and that I have to overcome on a daily basis to do the work that we do here at CASSA. We're also working in a very highly precarious sector that is built on colonial principles. Again, I'll go into that a little bit later, but the nonprofit sector is the foundations of it, is built on colonial practices, and as a result, there's a lot of problems and a lot of issues in the sector that we need to confront and we need to change. So again, we'll go into a little bit of that during the presentation. A little bit about CASSA. I think I've mentioned quite a bit already, but just in terms of our priorities. So we do a lot of work on anti-racism, anti-oppression, anti-homophobia, anti-hate, and again, collaboration and solidarity is key to the work that we do. Accountability to our members and accountability to our communities is something that we value, diversity and responsiveness. So I'll talk a little bit about diversity as well and what that means for us, and not just as a keyword that we use in a lot of the conversations that are happening today. And then responsiveness basically to the needs of the community. And as I mentioned before, community-informed work is very important to me personally and to our organization. So as we know, we're celebrating Asian Heritage Month. So at CASSA, we do coin it as South Asian Heritage Month, although we weren't given a South Asian Heritage Month. We were kind of just lumped into this one big category of Asian. So I just wanted to start us off with a little bit of a critical analysis of what it means to be Asian or South Asian. And if you are a person who identifies as South Asian, or a person that comes from geographically from a South Asian background, you'll know that it's not an identity that people readily identify with, right? So if you talk to people from the South Asian diaspora, they will first identify either with the country that they're coming from. So if it's from India or Pakistan or Bangladesh or Nepal or Sri Lanka, they will identify with that country, or they will identify with their ethnicity. So if they're Punjabi, or if they're Tamil, or if they're Bengali, or they will identify by their faith. So if they're Muslim or Sikh or Hindu or Christian or Buddhist, or they may identify by their language. So if they're Urdu speaking or Punjabi speaking. So this concept of South Asian is not a concept that we created for ourselves. It's a concept that was given to us, an identity that was given to us because of our colonial history. And we really have to be cognizant of this concept. And we have to make sure that when we are working with the Asian communities or the South Asian communities, we are not thinking it's just kind of one homogeneous group. And this is why we say communities in the plural format and not just community. So I, being somebody that is South Asian and leading an organization that serves South Asian, so I'll reflect mostly on the South Asian communities in my presentation, but I do also want to acknowledge that the concept of Asian is also a very colonial concept, and the Asian communities have similar grievances, but obviously I will leave that for today's presentation, as you know, for the interest of time. So again, just looking at the concept of South Asian and how much diversity it really encompasses, and whether or not it's a fair term to give to an entire population, entire segment of the continent. And that segment represents huge diversity. There's hundreds and thousands of languages that are spoken in this in these regions. There are so many different ethnic backgrounds, so many different religious backgrounds, so many different cultural practices. So it's really not fair for it to be lumped into this one group. So one of the, we struggle when it comes to Asian Heritage Month every May, because we want to celebrate the diversity within the diaspora, but then again, we're struggling with this colonial concept of breaking it and making it known to communities that it's not just one community. So before I go into talk a little bit about the nonprofit sector. So the couple of things that I want to do here in the time that I have is, obviously we did the critical analysis of what it means to be South Asian in today's context. I also want to discuss some of the things that we are going through as the not-for-profit sector when it comes to serving South Asian communities. And in order for me to do that, I think it's important for me to highlight some of the impact of COVID-19 on our communities. And again, it's on, I'm speaking for the South Asian communities and not for all racialized communities, but I know that there are similar outcomes for some racialized communities as a result of the pandemic. And finally, I'll end off with a little bit about our own South Asian Heritage Month campaign, which is on mental health this year, and what we're doing for the campaign, and we'll end the presentation there. And hopefully if there's any questions in the audience, we'll have some time to go through that. So I'll just go through a little bit on employment, health, hate crimes, and food insecurity. And that's not to say that these are the only areas that have had impact because of COVID on the communities. We also, as mentioned in the intro in my bio, that we do work on gender-based violence, and that is a critical area where that's been impacted by COVID. And we're doing some national research on gender-based violence on how services can be delivered to South Asian victims of gender-based violence in the context of a pandemic, where the victims may have several barriers and layers of barriers, including language barriers, technology barriers, access barriers. Given all of this, how do we provide services to this community? So it's definitely something that we're working on. Education is also something that was impacted, but just again, in the interest of time, because I have the 1 hour, I will stick to these 4 outcomes in employment, health, hate crimes, and food insecurity. So just some statistics. I won't go into detail and bore you with numbers, but feel free to take a look at the reports that I'm pulling these statistics from. So there was a national survey by the Association for Canadian Studies, which ranked economic vulnerability by ethnicity. And in that survey, I believe this was in 2020, late 2020, for South Asians, economic crisis was a major threat to their personal finance. So about 75% reported that economic crisis was a major threat to their personal finances. About 53% reported of South Asian reported they had trouble paying their bills. And about 65% reported that they suffered from income loss directly related to the pandemic. So these are some of the impacts. And there have been more recent studies as well in 2021 and 2022, but this is the data that I had access to at the time of making this presentation. So, and the data now is pretty much very similar to what it was back in 2020. Some racial and ethnic minority groups are disproportionately impacted in essential work. So I'm not sure if you remember, but back in 2020. Late 2020, we were hearing that South Asian communities in certain parts of the country were overrepresented or disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. And different discourses started as a result of that. Sorry, excuse me. Oops. Sorry, I'm just going to turn that off. Just give me 1 second. I'm so sorry about that. It's my work phone going off, and I didn't get a chance to turn it off before starting this presentation. Anyway, so in terms of the rhetoric we were hearing in 2020 about the South Asian communities, we heard that there was a lot of victim blaming and shaming that was happening. We were hearing stories coming from Peel region that basically said that South Asian communities weren't practicing COVID protocols. They weren't following regulations, and as a result, they were being infected by the virus. And, there wasn't any attention being paid to some of the root causes of why certain communities were overrepresented in terms of being infected by the virus. Things like where they worked, where South Asians were working, and what kind of work conditions they had. So we know that South Asians are overrepresented in healthcare facilities, on farms, in factories, in grocery stores, in public transportations, and being frontline in a time where, people were told to stay home, and people were told to work from home, work remotely. But if you're working in a position where that's not an option, you had to go out. And then on top of that, not being provided proper protection, not being provided sick days, resulted in a lot of people that were working in the sector and getting the virus and being infected by the virus. And again, I would say this is very similar to other racialized communities as well, who saw a similar infection rate. So similar to, a lot of these things are intertwined and interlinked. There's a quote by Arjun Siddiqui, who is a researcher at University of Toronto. And she mentioned that that in population health equity, racism essentially sets up whether you're able to have a life in which you can protect yourself from risk for any disease, including COVID, or whether you are forced into exposing yourself to the risk. So, we're talking about systemic forms of racism in which certain communities are overrepresented in low-paying frontline work. And we saw the direct impact of that in terms of the health of these communities. So in August of 2020, Peel Public Health published a report on the effect of social determinants of health on the number of COVID-19 cases. And they said that race and occupation played a main role in who was being infected and the numbers of those who were being infected by the virus. Hate crime. So a lot of the work that we do at CASSA, especially since 2019, I would say, is on anti-hate. We do a lot of anti-hate work, and we do a lot of work to combat online hate. So Statistics Canada released a survey and released the results of the survey in July 2020, which indicated that 27% of the participants who identify as visible minorities had felt somewhat unsafe walking home alone in their neighborhood after the pandemic started. And this is compared to 15% of the rest of the population. Just you can see the breakdown here between the different Asian communities. So the Korean, Filipino, Chinese, and South Asians. And we know that at that time and still now, Asian racism was on the rise. And a lot of hate towards Asian communities because of the scapegoating that came along with the pandemic. So a lot of communities began to feel unsafe. 38.9% of South Asians reported having experienced discrimination during the pandemic, and incidents of discrimination reported by South Asian and Black participants more often took place in a store, bank, or a restaurant. So just wanted to give you a synopsis of what was happening in the pandemic with South Asian and other racialized communities. Food insecurity was a huge thing as well, and we typically don't hear about it. And even for us, we weren't expecting this to be a huge thing in the South Asian community, but it was. And you probably heard in the news that food shelters were so busy during the pandemic. They were, working over capacity, under-resourced. And we had a similar experience where we heard from our community, especially for seniors who are having trouble accessing culturally appropriate food, and seniors that had, some kind of immunocompromised system where they weren't able to go out of their homes to do grocery shopping. They're really stuck at home and didn't know where to seek help. So CASSA, though we are an umbrella agency that doesn't provide frontline services, we had to step in this role to provide food to South Asian seniors and other racialized seniors. We secured some funds from government as well as foundations and United Way as well to create a food hamper program for South Asian seniors. And literally, we ran out of funds in day 3 of the program, and we had several hundreds of food baskets that we delivered to racialized seniors all over the GTA, and we had a waiting list of 1,000 people that were still waiting for food baskets, and we had to partner with food banks. We had to get volunteers on board to help the seniors that were still on the waiting list. The issue was that they weren't able to access food that was culturally appropriate for them at mainstream food banks and mainstream food shelters. So they didn't access those services, and we still to this day get calls from our seniors that we served back in 2020 and 2021 asking if we're still doing the food hamper program. Unfortunately, we're not doing the food hamper program anymore, but we are able to connect them to food banks that are now providing culturally appropriate food to racialized seniors. And this was some of the things that we advocated for back in 2020 and 2021. So what does all of this mean for the nonprofit sector? So we know that during the pandemic, it was the nonprofit sector that really had to step up and really had to serve their communities. All of these things, the issues around employment, the issues around health, the issues around hate crimes, on food insecurity, and other things that I mentioned, like gender-based violence, puts a huge, immense pressure on South Asian serving agencies and agencies that serve other racialized communities. And we had, as I mentioned, similar outcomes and sometimes worse outcomes actually for certain communities like the Black and Indigenous communities. So really the nonprofit sector had to step up and do something. So how were they able to do this in a time where most organizations that were large mainstream organizations were struggling to keep their doors open? They didn't know how to provide services virtually, and they just had a huge bureaucratic process, which didn't allow them to innovate and to meet the needs of the communities that they were funded to serve, that they were funded millions of dollars to serve. And what happened as a result of that gap in service delivery, and again, I'm specifically going to talk about South Asian communities, is that community-based organizations and ethnic organizations really stepped up, and grassroots groups really stepped up. I remember back in 2020, there was hundreds of these local community groups that started to deliver groceries to people that were immunocompromised or seniors or single mothers. Volunteers, I became part of some of these groups, and volunteers literally were like fighting each other to see who would do the next grocery delivery. So really on the ground, grassroots organizing happened, and also community-based agencies that had a lot of trust and that relationship was already built with their communities. They were still able to stay in touch with their communities, whereas everybody else was really struggling. They overcame hurdles, they overcame some of the barriers to service delivery much better than large mainstream organizations and even government. And government and these large mainstream organizations were unable to utilize their funds and their networks in the same way that these smaller organizations were able to do. And things like creating simple channels of communication. So whether it's like just a regular local phone number that they provided to their community members, if they needed anything or if they had any questions, they could just call in and get some support. Some of the things that we did at CASSA in partnership with our members and faith groups and volunteers included the food hamper program that I just spoke about. We also created a helpline for South Asians. So it was a very simple, low-key, local number that people in the GTA could call. We also had a toll-free number for people outside of the GTA. They could call and they would be prompted in 6 different languages. So it would just ask you, do you speak Bangla or Urdu or Hindi or Punjabi or Tamil? And they would direct you to somebody live who could speak that language. And you could ask them any COVID relief related question. You could ask them. We also were in operation during the vaccination campaigns. And you can ask them questions about the vaccine, where to get bookings. We actually did bookings on behalf of a lot of our seniors in our communities. And it was just a very low-key way for people to contact us and to speak to somebody that they could understand and that could provide them information that they could understand. And they didn't need a smartphone to do it. They didn't need to log on to social media to do it. So it was something that was really appreciated by the community. Again, there are people that still call our local number, and I think their phone rang because we do have people in the community that still call us, even though we don't provide frontline services. They still call us because of the support we provided them during the pandemic to ask us questions about relief programs from government, benefit programs, about vaccination, boosters, and things like that. So they will call us once in a while, even now, even if we don't have the program, because they've developed that trust and that relationship with our organization. We also created these hygiene packages, which we distributed to shelters across the GTA that had a high concentration of South Asian and other racialized communities for homeless people. And these hygiene packages contain things like hygiene things for people to keep themselves safe, like sanitizers and wipes, and it was at that time where we literally could not find toilet paper. So we were able to secure a lot of these items for people that are really vulnerable and didn't have a place that they could, stay home and work remotely and like the rest of us. And we recognized these people really needed some support. So we did that. And I'm just giving examples of what we did, but that's just to show that a lot of organizations were on a similar path, and they were able to pivot, and they were able to adjust, and they were able to listen to their communities and provide support in response to those needs. And finally, the South Asian Heritage Month 2022, our mental health campaign. So this year, so before I go into our campaign, I just want to give some statistics on the mental health challenges in South Asian communities. So there's several research out there that shows mental health in racialized communities, immigrant communities, has suffered as a result of the pandemic. And we know throughout the board, mental health is a big concern for a lot of communities as a result of the pandemic and because of the impact that the pandemic has had on people. So in one of the studies, South Asians reported lower levels of mental health than other visible minorities during the pandemic. And I say visible minorities here because that's the language that's used in the research. But if it's a research project that we do in-house, we like to say racialized communities, if we're comparing it to just racialized communities or racialized and indigenous communities, for comparing to both. They reported fair or poor self-rated mental health. They reported somewhat or much worse mental health since the pandemic started. And their symptoms were consistent with moderate or severe generalized anxiety disorder. So what we wanted to do this year for South Asian Heritage Month, so every year we choose an area to highlight, either research in the area or work that's being done in the area, but we want to highlight individuals from the South Asian Canadian communities that have been doing really great work in that particular field. And because of the impact that we saw on mental health on South Asians during the pandemic, we decided to focus on that as our topic for the 2022 South Asian Heritage Month. We saw that there's many challenges that were associated with working with South Asians on mental health. And similar, like I said, there may be similar issues with other racialized communities. The stigma of mental health is huge in the South Asian community. And again, maybe similar in other communities as well. The lack of adequate resources that are culturally competent and effective based on the unique challenges faced by South Asians is definitely an issue that we've heard over and over again. And again, we wanted to feature leaders in the community that are breaking down some of these barriers and shaking some of these walls to make mental health support more accessible for South Asians and reduce the stigma that exists in the community. So this is our 2022 South Asian Heritage Month poster. We've highlighted 7 amazing individuals, South Asian Canadians of excellence, who have been doing mental health advocacy work or practicing in the field of mental health and working to create resources and improve access for South Asian communities. So we have Dr. Farah Islam, Dr. Farooq Naeem, Dr. Parvati Kandasamy, Mani Chahal, Jasmeet Chaggar, Dr. Rupa Daman Singh Minhas, and Rita Kohli. And as you can see in the South, this identity of South Asian, this overarching identity, we have to be mindful to be as inclusive as possible of the different identities that are included in the word South Asian. And we have to be inclusive of people that are in the diaspora. Obviously, we in a poster that features 6 to 8 individuals, we're not able to capture all of that diversity. But we try our best to include people from different parts of the diaspora, people that are of different faith, people that are of different ethnic backgrounds, or that speak different languages, that work with people of different backgrounds as well. So these are the 7 individuals that we've highlighted, and there's 3 things that we intend to do through this campaign. First is to recognize, acknowledge, and celebrate South Asian Canadian excellence, and in a space that is traditionally dominated by non-racialized folks. And we have that issue with almost all of the topics that we select every year. In the space that we are focusing on, the recognition aspect is dominated by non-racialized folks. And so we want to recognize that there are South Asian Canadians that are doing excellent work in this field, and this poster is just one way to do it. The second thing is we want to bring awareness of the issue of mental health to South Asian communities. As I mentioned, stigma is a huge part, and we hope that, you know, through this work and to bring attention to some of the work that people are doing, we can reduce some of that stigma. And finally, one of the things that, which is my favorite part of this campaign, is to inspire children and youth by providing them examples of leaders who may look like them or sound like them, or may come from, you know, similar background as them. And that encourages our children and our youth to have impact in that particular area. So if they thought that, you know, I want to be a mental health practitioner, if I want to be a counselor, but they don't see anybody that looks like them in that role, this poster really aims to be that inspiration for children and for youth, and you know, connect with these people and talk to them and get involved in that field if that is, you know, something that they're interested in doing. And the final thing that I just want to say is, so next week on Wednesday, we have our South Asian Heritage Month panel discussion. So in our celebration of South Asian Heritage Month, and I'm really grateful for Western University to host this event, and I believe you're hosting other events similar to it. Instead of just creating events where there's Bollywood music and you're just celebrating culture in a very superficial way. And you know, in the past, I've had my share of attending South Asian Heritage Month events where it's just entertainment, which is great. Culture is very important, but I think these kind of critical conversations are also so important in that celebration aspect. And so this poster campaign that we do every year, we've done it since 2016 now, is to do the celebration part, which is to recognize these leaders, but then also to have critical conversations around barriers and access in the areas, in the area that we've selected for that particular year. So on Wednesday, May 25th, 4 to 6 p.m., we are hoping to have a conversation with these folks that we've highlighted about the field of mental health, you know, how they got into the field, and what it is, what it's like for a South Asian person of South Asian background to be in that field. What are some barriers that they're seeing for the community to access resources? What are some of the things that they're working on? I know Dr. Minhas has been doing really amazing work and utilizing social media to educate people on kids' mental health, and just doing really short TikTok videos for young parents on kids' mental health, and then doing things in different South Asian languages for older folks that may have language barriers on what mental health really is and how they can support their families if they're having a difficult time, if they're having a crisis, what they can do, what are some of the resources that they can approach. So really a great group of individuals that are doing different work, but then all of it is to build the capacity of their communities to access resources, and to make some systemic changes so that the field of mental health and resources that are provided in mental health can be tailored towards the needs of the communities. And as I mentioned, mental health, the way that it impacts certain individuals, what they're experiencing, their social identities, their intersection of identities has a lot to do with how they are being impacted. Their immigration pattern, the way that they face racism, the way that they face hate, may or may not face hate has a lot to do with how their mental health is impacted. And all of that has to be taken into account when providing those resources and those services, and that counseling, to be aware and to have that knowledge of those oppressions and of that racism that people may face, and then find solutions and then find resources to support them. So would love to see folks from this audience join us for that. I can provide a link in the chat for people to register for that event. It's a virtual event just like this one. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and turn it back to Mars to see if there's any questions from the audience.
Thank you so much, Samya, for such an engaging, presentation. For myself, one thing that you said very early on, and I found the link on Eventbrite's website, so that's there too for our audience members if you're interested. I think early in the beginning, you had said that South Asian identifying individuals sometimes don't see themselves as that, and they refer to their ethnicity. Like for myself, part of my ethnicity is Pakistani, like you. And so whenever somebody would ask me, I'd be like, oh yeah, I'm Pakistani and, like, in this case, Kenyan or African, I would say, because that's the other half. And so I think that was something that really stood out to me personally that you highlighted. I'd like to tell the audience that if they have questions, to please submit them into the Q&A, and then I will read them off and we can get started. But I do have some questions that to get us started. Thank you so much once again for such an engaging presentation. And you talked about the nonprofit sector, which is something that CASSA works in. And do you, like, I try to think about connections to something like university, where the Office of EDI is situated, and I guess I wanted you to speak to perhaps some of the connections and similarities that you see within these, because a university is seen as a nonprofit sort of organization as well, with some elements of profit and things like that. But I guess if there's anything that you could speak to on the connections and how universities can sort of follow this model that CASSA has been providing on community-based sort of interactions and projects and so on.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a really great question. And I've seen some universities really kind of starting this journey of being community-based once again. So I think in the past, the institution of a university has been really removed from the community. And, it's been kind of this hierarchy that's been established, where the university is kind of this institution way up here, and then the communities down here. So it's just, and filling this now, kind of trying to bridge this gap, is something that I've seen some universities start to do. I think it's just really recognizing the institutional values of the university. So why do we create universities in the first place? Why do we educate our youth in universities? And we're created to serve the community, right? We're created for the benefit and for the social well-being of the community, not to have some kind of elitist mentality, right? So I think for a lot of universities, that exists still, right? So, and there's a lot of work to be done to come to that level of understanding. And I think first and foremost, really evaluating that intention and that mission of the university, that you are created for the benefit of the communities, not to be removed from the community. So consider yourself as part of the community. And the other thing that I think is important is establishing trust with the community, and not just for the sake of securing funds or getting that next SHRC grant or whatever it may be, but actually because you want to help improve outcomes in the community that you're located in, right? So most universities have certain geographic area in which they're located in, and that's the communities that they want to serve. And building that relationship, and how do you establish that trust, is to build that relationship with the grassroots organizations and with the ethnic organizations. And we're located in Scarborough. Our head office is in Scarborough, and we've started to do that with the University of Toronto Scarborough, where we actually have monthly meetings with them, and we just update them on what we're doing, and they tell us what they're doing. And then we have synergies, or not. Sometimes they're not, and sometimes there are. And so we're able to collaborate on things that way, right? So that ongoing communication and that relationship that needs to be built with the nonprofit sector has to be intentional, and there will be work that's involved in doing that, right? So more resources might be required at the university level to have somebody that is dedicated to building that connection and that relationship with community organizations. So I think learning from community organizations, I think, can only happen once that communication is established, once that relationship is built, and then involving those organizations in the work that is going on in the university. So if there is research going on at the university, involve community-based organizations, right, as advisory on, what kind of questions are you going to ask? What is the research methodology? How are you going to do outreach to certain segments of the population that are normally disengaged from research that happens in institutions? So really establishing that connection, that relationship with the nonprofit organizations, with ethnic organizations that exist in your local geographic area is the way to go.
I mean, that is a fantastic insight, Samya. Thank you so much for that. And we do have a question, and I think I love that this question came up because we're talking about a university that has influence in a community and stuff. And I know you had mentioned that CASSA sort of struggled a little bit in providing for the community, like first response services and stuff like that. And so one of the questions by one of our audience members is, governments, like how can governments play a more useful role in terms of grants, partnerships, beyond just the funding sort of aspect? What role do or how can you see governments playing into this much more and having a more active role?
So one of the things that I spoke briefly about is this colonial concept of the nonprofit sector, right? So we are created with certain principles that we will do work for very little money. And it's a system that is very exploitative. It exploits people that work in the sector. And I think that entire structure of the nonprofit sector needs to change, and government has a huge role to play in that. So one of the things that we've done over the last 2.5 years is to bring attention to the fact that while everybody else basically failed to provide services to the communities, it was the nonprofit sector, and particularly smaller community-based organizations, that stepped up and provided those essential services to their communities. So why not trust them to do the work? Why not build their capacity, provide them the resources to do it, as opposed to expecting them to do it for pennies, right? So really looking at critically, what kind of system are we upholding in the nonprofit sector? And I've got amazing people that work for me at our organization, but sometimes I wonder, like, why are we not able to offer them more money? Like, why can't we offer them permanent positions here at CASSA? And it's because we're a smaller not-for-profit organization that is community-based ethnic organization. And traditionally, organizations like us are not able to secure funds. And even within the nonprofit sector, there's this competition that goes on in the background where larger organizations and smaller organizations are competing for funds. And often those funds will go to larger mainstream organizations that have been around for decades and already receive millions of dollars. But when it comes time to serving specific communities that are marginalized, they have no connections and they have no networks there. So really building that capacity, and government has a huge role in providing capacity building resources to community-based organizations so that they're able to do the work that they're already doing, but but they're getting paid to do it, right? As opposed to doing volunteer work for years and years. I have member organizations that have been around for decades and they're surviving on volunteers. And I just think that's an unfair system to go.
Absolutely. I mean, I totally understand what you've been saying, and I think it's really important to the sense of responsibility, like you sort of, and accountability that, you know, within South Asian communities, there's a sense of community, and, you know, that needs to extend to governments, that need to extend to universities and so on. And I guess we have time for one more question, and I'll pose this question to you. You know, to people of non-South Asian ethnicity, what are some things that you can say that they can be allies? I know accomplices is another term being thrown out now to go one step beyond allyship and actually be part of the process. I think in a university setting, we have a lot of non-Asian identifying students here at Western. How can staff, you know, professors, teachers, facilitators make and do for their South Asian students or staff or faculty to bring in that sense of belonging? Is something that I know that's a term that's been being thrown around, is how much do you feel that you belong in sort of institutions? It's kind of a long-winded question. I know this could probably be a whole nother presentation for you, but if there's anything that you would like to say, that would be fantastic.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, believe it or not, I've done 2-hour presentations on just allyship. So I'll put it succinctly in 2 minutes if I can. I think the most important thing is if we have the intention of practicing allyship is really making that relational. And so I attended one session, and I can't remember the name of the person that said it, but they gave the example of a transactional allyship versus relational allyship. And what we want to aim for is a relational allyship where it's not just a performative thing where we release a statement now and then to say that we support these communities, or we share their social media posts, but then internally we're not really doing anything in collaboration to support those communities. So really looking at how can we use and I mentioned this in my intro, is how can we use the power and privilege we have as non-racialized or non-Asian in individuals and communities to give them a voice, or to provide space, and not to give them a voice, but to provide our space, to give up our space to them, so that they can speak their voice, right? So they can speak about the issues that they have. So oftentimes I'm on a table or a position or at an event where if I don't see representations from the Black community, or if I don't see representation from the Indigenous community, I will call that out, and I say, don't you need feedback from those communities, because this, health equity impacts them very much so. So I think using that position you have to really bring in those people to that space, the space where they can have their voices heard and where the decisions are made. And sometimes it might mean giving up your own seat and giving up your own space, right, to do that. That's one thing. The other thing is a lot of people are still doing the learning aspect. And one thing that I like to say about learning is don't expect the learning all to come from the people that are being oppressed and marginalized, right? So the onus of learning is on you and on us. There's already so much resources and content that's created by communities, by racialized communities, Indigenous communities. And it's just that burden should be on your shoulders to go and learn, to see how you can be a relational ally and not just a transactional ally. There's thousands of research already that's being done, and Black Lives Matter has a huge publication that like literally spells it out for you, what they want you to do as an ally. So so don't just sit there and say like, I don't know what to do, I want to help. Go do the research, it's already out there. And then really reflect your intentions on why you're doing it and how you're doing it.
Thank you so much. And I know that you just put the offer out there to talk about transactional versus relational allyship. So we'll probably have you again here to talk about that.
I'd be happy to.
Oh, absolutely. And so I guess that ends our Q&A. I just wanted to, Samya, give you a chance to give any last comments or insights to our audience today before we commence with ending the seminar.
Yeah, I think I would just say that, again, I'm very happy that Western University has taken this step, and I'm sure others as well, other steps as well, to be more community centric and hear directly from the voices of the communities. And I would encourage you to continue to build on those partnerships and not just have, these one-off events. These are great, but I think really use these events to build that relationship that I was talking about, and not just with our organization, but with other organizations, with leaders, with faith groups, with grassroots groups that are in your community, to really learn about what the needs of your students are, and to be to be intentional in helping those students break those barriers that they're experiencing. I'm sure that there's a large group of racialized students and potentially Indigenous students at Western as well. So really encourage you to go beyond one-time events and create programs and create ways for you to stay in touch and do ongoing communication, and create partnerships that are meaningful with community groups and leaders.
Thank you so much, and challenge accepted. Our office will and Western is going to do our very best to not only connect more with CASSA, but with other organizations like you speak of as well. I just wanted to thank our audience and everyone for attending. Thank you to Central Communications to help us host these events, and everyone involved in bringing the webinar together. And a very, very special thank you to Samya for sharing your information, more importantly, your experience with us today. It is very valuable for everyone to hear. And lastly, I do urge our audience and anyone else who might find out about this event, the link is in the chat, and I urge you to attend CASSA's panel discussion on South Asian Heritage Month. And on that note, I'd like to say thank you for joining us for this speaking session during Asian Heritage Month. Special thank you to Samya once again. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.